I heard my name through a half-open door the day before my wedding, followed by laughter. Not nervous laughter, not awkward laughter, the kind that comes when everyone feels safe enough to be cruel. That's when I realized this marriage would end before it ever began.
My name is Brielle Carson, and this is the story of how I heard my own survival turned into a punchline the day before my wedding and chose to speak first at the altar instead of spending my life shrinking for their comfort.
I was 37 when I learned how easy it is to confuse control with care, especially when it's wrapped in soft voices and public praise.
From the outside, my relationship with Malcolm Grayson looked solid, enviable even. He was attentive in rooms full of witnesses, quick to reach for my hand, quicker to call me his future. Friends said I was lucky. His family said I was chosen. And for a long time, I wanted to believe that choosing me meant protecting me. Malcolm had a way of presenting himself as a man who knew better.
Better taste, better judgment, better timing.
When he suggested outfits, he framed it as guidance. When he corrected the way I spoke in certain company, it was refinement. When he asked me to retake photos before posting them, it was branding.
He never raised his voice.
He never demanded outright.
He simply smiled and said, "Trust me." And I did, because trust felt easier than questioning someone who sounded so certain. His mother, Yvette, was the quiet architect behind much of that certainty.
She spoke in compliments sharpened into instructions. She'd look me up and down and say I had so much potential if I just learned moderation. Portions. Poses. Silence. Yvette believed discipline was love, and Malcolm absorbed that philosophy without ever examining the cost. Around her, I learned to sit straighter, laugh smaller, and disappear politely while they discussed me as if I were a project already underway. What made it unbearable wasn't just the comments or the glances. It was the precision. Malcolm knew exactly where to touch the bruise. Long before him, I had fought my body like an enemy. I had counted, restricted, punished, negotiated with hunger as if it were a moral failing. Therapy hadn't been a quick fix. It had been a slow excavation of shame. I had learned to eat without bargaining, to look in mirrors without flinching, to exist without measuring myself into worthiness.
I told Malcolm about that night I finally broke.
About sitting on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub, convinced I had failed at being a person because I couldn't control my reflection. I told him about the doctor's voice, calm and exact, listing numbers I memorized because they terrified me. I told him how ashamed I was of how small I had tried to make myself just to feel safe. He listened. He held my hand. He said, "Thank you for trusting me with this." And I believed him because I needed to believe that kind of vulnerability had a place to land. After that, I noticed the shift. The way he'd joke lightly about food choices in front of others, then glance at me to see if I'd react. The way he'd say, "You're doing so much better now," as if I were a renovation he supervised. I told myself I was being sensitive. That healing meant letting go of old triggers. That love required grace. Each time I swallowed a response, I told myself the wedding would reset the balance. That once I was officially his wife, I'd be safe enough to stop performing improvement. There were moments that should have stopped me. A family gathering where Yvette praised another woman's discipline while cutting a slice of cake smaller than a napkin and sliding it toward me with a smile. A dinner where Malcolm laughed when someone asked how I stayed so fit, answering for me, "She's very focused." The silence after those moments felt like a test I kept passing by saying nothing. I wasn't naive. I was hopeful. I wanted the story where patience paid off,
where endurance was rewarded with respect. I believed that being chosen meant being cherished, not curated. And in that belief, I let myself shrink just enough to fit the version of me they applauded. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself love would catch up.
By the time the wedding was days away, I was exhausted from being grateful for crumbs. I mistook that exhaustion for nerves. I told myself every bride felt this way. What I didn't realize yet was that my body already knew the truth my mind was still negotiating, that a man who laughs with others about your pain has already decided whose comfort matters more. The day before the wedding, I arrived early because I needed a pocket of quiet that didn't belong to anyone else. The rehearsal schedule had been packed with instructions, corrections, photos, and small performances of harmony, and I wanted one moment where my breath wasn't being managed. I told myself I was being responsible, that a calm bride keeps things smooth, but the truth was simpler. I felt cornered by all the smiling, and I wanted to touch something real before I stepped into another room full of expectations. The building was already awake in that way venues get before ceremonies, with staff moving chairs, cords taped down, and little clusters of family members pretending not to be anxious. Somewhere in the back, a coordinator was testing a microphone and saying, "Check, check," as if sound could be controlled just by repeating it. I watched Yvette glide past in heels that clicked like punctuation, her face set in the kind of focus that told me she believed this day was her victory lap. She didn't greet me like a future daughter-in-law. She nodded like a supervisor, acknowledging a worker who showed up on time. Malcolm wasn't in the main hall yet, which should have been a relief, but it made my stomach tighten. When he wasn't nearby, I had this strange sensation of being unsupervised, like I could accidentally exist wrong and no one would correct it in time. I hated that feeling. Hated that I had learned to expect correction the way you expect weather, like it's not personal, just unavoidable. I shook it off and told myself, "You're just nervous. You're just tired. You're just ready for this to be over." I headed toward the side room where my shoes had been left after the last fitting. I remember thinking about how ridiculous it was that something as small as a pair of heels could feel like a lifeline. Put 'em on, stand tall, get through it. I turned the corner and saw the door slightly open, the light inside spilling into the hallway. I slowed without knowing why, as if my body sensed danger before my mind could name it. At first, I heard laughter, relaxed and easy, the kind you hear when someone feels safe among their own. It wasn't the nervous laughter of rehearsal stress. It was the private laughter of a group that thinks no one outside the circle matters. I recognized Malcolm's voice under the noise, warm and familiar, and for 1 second my chest loosened because I thought, he's in a good mood. Maybe today will be gentle. Then I heard my name, not spoken like a bride's name, not spoken with affection, but tossed out like a setup. I stopped so fast my heel caught on the edge of the carpet. I could have announced myself. I could have pushed the door open and forced the room into politeness. Instead, I stayed frozen because a part of me needed to know what my name sounded like when I wasn't in the room to manage it. Malcolm said it with a laugh in his voice, like he was about to deliver a story he'd told before. "Bro, she used to count almonds." Literally. The word landed like a slap because it wasn't exaggeration. It was my truth, stripped of context, turned into entertainment. My throat tightened so quickly I had to swallow twice, as if my body was trying to swallow the sound itself. Someone else, a man I didn't recognize by voice, replied like this was a game. Like, how bad was it? There was curiosity in his tone, casual and hungry, as if my pain was a headline he wanted the details of. I pressed my fingertips against the wall, steadying myself. And my mind did that old familiar thing where it tried to minimize, to negotiate.
Maybe they're talking about someone else. Maybe he's warning them not to joke.
Maybe he's shutting it down right now.
He didn't.
Malcolm answered like he was discussing a movie scene.
She stopped eating for a while. Doctor said numbers. I don't even remember exactly. He said it with a shrug in his voice, like the details didn't matter. Like the exact words the doctor used, the way my hand shook, the way I couldn't look at my own face without flinching, were all just background noise to him now. I remember a flash of heat behind my eyes, not tears yet, just heat, the beginning of something that wanted to burst. He doesn't remember the numbers, I thought, and it hit me with a kind of quiet cruelty. I remembered them because they had ruled me. I remembered the exact tone of the doctor, the exact pause before she said, "This is serious," the exact moment my heart dropped because I realized I couldn't out-discipline what I was doing to myself. Those numbers had been my prison bars, and he was telling a room full of men he couldn't remember exactly. Another voice chimed in, a woman this time, maybe a cousin or a friend of Yvette's, and she sounded amused, not horrified. Well, at least now she eats cake. The room erupted again, louder, as if the punchline had been waiting to land. The laughter wasn't just sound. It was agreement. It was approval. It was permission. I stood there and realized something even worse than the words. Malcolm was performing. This wasn't an accidental slip. This was him offering my most vulnerable confession as currency to buy their affection. I could picture his face, that easy grin, the one he used when he wanted to be liked. He was feeding them my private story, the way you feed a crowd what it wants, and the crowd wanted me reduced to a joke. My mind started replaying every moment I had trusted him. The night I told him, my voice shaking, I've never said this out loud, his hands holding mine, his eyes soft, his voice low. You can tell me anything. I remember thinking, finally, someone who won't weaponize me. Standing outside that door, I felt the floor drop out from under that memory. It didn't vanish. It didn't become false. It became something uglier, proof that he had always had access to my softest parts, and he had simply been waiting for the moment it would benefit him to use them. Inside the room, the conversation rolled on, and I forced myself to keep listening, because once you're bleeding, you want to know how deep the cut is. Malcolm kept going, not with concern, not with respect, but with that smug tone of someone who believes he's telling a story that makes him look good. He said something like, I had to talk her down sometimes, you know? Like I was a hero. Like I was the steady one. Like my suffering was a test he passed and deserved praise for. One of the men whistled and said, Man, you're a saint. The word saint made my stomach twist. A saint for what exactly? For being present while I fought a war inside my own head? For staying with me because it made him look loyal? For holding my hand while secretly filing my pain away as future material? I felt a cold clarity settle over me. He didn't see me as someone he loved. He saw me as a story that made him look like a good man. I wanted to open that door and look him in the eye and ask why. I wanted to watch the color drain from his face. I wanted to hear him try to explain himself, to watch him scramble for the right words, because I knew he'd try to wrap this in something respectable. He'd say they were just joking. He'd say I was overreacting. He'd say he didn't mean it like that. He'd say he was trying to lighten the mood. And then he'd kiss my forehead in front of others like that erased everything. I didn't go in because I saw the trap for what it was. If I burst into that room, I would become the problem. The sensitive bride. The emotional woman.
The one who can't take a joke.
I would give them a scene to label me with, and Malcolm would stand there with his palms up like he was the reasonable one.
I had spent too long living inside their version of me. I wasn't going to hand them a new chapter, so I stepped back silently, and my body moved as if it had its own plan. I walked away from the door with the same careful pace I used when I was carrying something breakable.
My hands were steady, which surprised me.
My heart was loud, but it wasn't panicking.
It was deciding. There is a difference between fear and clarity, and I felt clarity settle into my bones like a weight that made me stand straighter. In the hallway, I paused near a window and stared at my reflection in the glass. For a second, I saw myself the way I used to see myself back then, when I measured everything and still felt wrong. Then that reflection shifted, and I saw something else. A woman who had survived a version of herself that tried to disappear and who had earned the right not to be mocked for it. I pressed a hand against my sternum and thought, you didn't claw your way out of that darkness just to marry a man who jokes about it for laughs. The strange part was how calm I became. The humiliation was still there, sharp and hot, but it was contained, like a blade I could hold by the handle.
I understood the real injury wasn't that his friends laughed.
The real injury was that Malcolm offered it to them. He chose their laughter over my dignity, and he did it the day before we were supposed to stand in front of guests and promise protection. When I returned to the main hall, Malcolm was already out there, smiling, greeting relatives, looking every bit like the groom in control. He saw me and walked over, his expression softening into that practiced tenderness. "There you are," he said, reaching for my waist. "You okay? You disappeared."
I held his gaze and made my face neutral.
"I'm fine," I said, and the words felt like stepping stones across a river. "Just grabbing my shoes." He chuckled lightly, as if the idea of me searching for shoes was cute. "Don't stress, baby. Tomorrow you just show up and look perfect." He said perfect like it was a promise and a warning at the same time. I nodded. In my head, I answered him with a truth I didn't say out loud. "Tomorrow, I'm going to show up and look real, and you're going to learn the difference." That night, I barely slept, not because I was unraveling, but because my mind had shifted into a different gear. I recognized it from therapy, from the months when survival turned into strategy. Panic scatters thoughts.
Clarity lines them up.
I lay awake replaying the scene behind that door, not to torture myself, but to catalog it. Who laughed? Who stayed silent? Who sounded uncomfortable, but didn't intervene? Malcolm's tone. The exact phrasing. The way he framed himself as patient, generous, long-suffering. I wasn't rehearsing a confrontation. I was building a map. By morning, the hurt had settled into something colder and more focused. I understood that if I acted from rage, I would hand him the narrative. He would become the calm man managing an emotional bride. I had lived long enough under quiet correction to know how that story ends. So I chose a different approach. I decided to let the truth speak in a language they couldn't interrupt. The first person I approached was Denise Grayson. Malcolm's aunt had always hovered at the edges of family gatherings, observant, rarely loud, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. She wasn't dazzled by Yvette's authority or Malcolm's charm. She watched patterns. When I found her alone adjusting programs near the entrance, I didn't ease into it. I said, "He mocked my eating disorder yesterday. He laughed about it with his friends." The words felt heavy but clean as they left my mouth. Denise didn't ask me to calm down. She didn't suggest misunderstanding. Her face tightened in a way that told me she was running her own inventory of memories. She said quietly, "I've seen him perform before." Then she looked at me and added, If you want to do this right, you need proof. Not for revenge, for reality. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone.
We moved carefully. Denise spoke to the rehearsal coordinator under the pretense of logistics and asked about camera coverage in the hallway near the side rooms. There were cameras positioned for security, not storytelling, but they captured movement clearly. The footage showed me stopping at the door, standing there longer than anyone should, then stepping back while laughter spilled out. It didn't capture sound, but it captured context. It showed who was inside. It showed who exited still smiling. It showed me absorbing something I hadn't consented to. The second piece came unexpectedly. One of the groomsmen, a man named Terrence, cornered Denise later that afternoon to brag about his speech. He was proud of it, proud of how funny he thought he was going to be. He played a voice memo on his phone, laughing as he did. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but Denise did, and she recognized the words immediately. The same line about almonds. The same punchline about cake. My story, rehearsed for applause. When Denise brought the recording to me, my hands shook, not with fear, but with recognition. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a theme. My vulnerability had become a running joke, passed around casually, packaged for entertainment. I listened once, then turned it off. I didn't need to hear it again. I needed to decide how to use it. The hardest part of strategy is restraint. Every instinct in me wanted to expose him immediately, to walk into a room and say, "This is who you're marrying." But restraint is how you change the outcome instead of just the moment. I asked Denise to coordinate with the officiant and the AV team without telling them details, only that I had a personal statement to make before vows. I spoke to the wedding planner with the same calm voice Malcolm used when he wanted things his way. I said it was important.
I said it was meaningful.
I said it was non-negotiable. Meanwhile, I played my role.
I smiled.
I answered questions. I let Yvette adjust my veil and comment on my posture.
Inside, I was watching everything with new eyes.
Malcolm's confidence. His ease. The way he moved through rooms, assuming compliance. He had no idea the ground had shifted beneath him. That ignorance wasn't accidental. It was built on years of me swallowing discomfort to keep the peace. There was a moment that nearly broke my composure. Malcolm pulled me aside and said, "You've been quiet. You nervous?" His hand rested on my back, possessive, familiar. I looked at him and saw not my partner, but a man who believed he had already won. I said, "I'm clear." And for the first time, that was true. The night before the wedding, I stood alone and thought about silence.
How often I had used it as armor. How often I had mistaken endurance for strength.
Silence had protected me once, when speaking would have cost me more than I could afford. But silence has a shelf life. When it outlives its purpose, it turns inward and starts eroding you from the inside. I realized then that my silence had trained Malcolm and his family to believe my boundaries were imaginary. I wasn't planning a spectacle. I wasn't chasing humiliation for its own sake. I was correcting a lie that had been told about me in rooms I wasn't supposed to enter. The lie was that my pain was negotiable. The truth was that my survival was not a punchline, and anyone who needed it to be one did not deserve a front row seat in my life. As the morning arrived and the venue filled with guests, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness, not joy, not dread, alignment. Every piece was in place. The recordings, the footage, the permission. I wasn't walking toward a man. I was walking toward my own voice, and I wasn't planning to apologize for how loud it would sound. The morning of the ceremony felt strangely quiet inside me. as if my body had already crossed a line my mind was still catching up to. People assume calm on a wedding day comes from certainty about love. For me, it came from certainty about truth. Once you stop bargaining with it, your pulse steadies. I let the stylist fuss, let Yvette hover with last-minute instructions, let Malcolm's sisters tell me how lucky I was. None of it reached me. I was already standing somewhere else internally, watching the day unfold like a sequence I had memorized. When the music began and the doors opened, I felt eyes land on me in waves. Admiration, curiosity, expectation. Malcolm stood at the front, tall and composed, the picture of a man about to be rewarded. He smiled at me the way he always did in public, like he was proud of how well I played my role. For a moment, I wondered if he could sense the difference, if something in my posture or gaze warned him. If he did, he ignored it. Men like Malcolm mistake silence for surrender, right up until it costs them. We reached the front, and the officiant began the familiar rhythm of words meant to soothe and sanctify. When he asked if we were ready to exchange vows, I felt the room lean forward. That collective inhale before a promise. I lifted my hand gently, not rushed, not shaking. "May I speak first?" I said, my voice clear enough to travel without a microphone. A ripple moved through the guests. Surprise, not alarm. The officiant hesitated, then nodded. I turned slightly, not away from Malcolm, but not toward him either. I faced the room that had gathered to witness a union they believed in. I was taught that love is protection, I began. That when someone trusts you with their most fragile truth, you guard it. You don't repeat it. You don't reshape it. You don't trade it for laughter. Malcolm's smile tightened. I could feel it without looking. Some stories are not meant to be shared, I continued. They are meant to be respected. I paused, letting the quiet stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then I said, yesterday, during our rehearsal, the man I was supposed to marry decided that my survival was funny, that the hardest period of my life was good material for a joke. A murmur moved through the pews. Yvette straightened sharply, her eyes scanning the room like she could locate and contain the damage by force of will. I nodded to the coordinator. The screen behind the altar lit up. No sound, just images. Me stopping at the door. Me standing still. The door opening. Laughter spilling out as people exited, Malcolm among them, relaxed and pleased. I let it play just long enough for recognition to dawn. Then the audio clip followed. Terrence's voice, unmistakable. She used to count almonds, literally. A laugh. At least now she eats cake. The punchline landed again, this time in a room that didn't consent to it. I raised my hand and the clip stopped. I'm not here to explain my body, I said. I'm not here to list diagnoses or justify healing. I'm here to name a line that was crossed. I turned then, finally, to Malcolm. His face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen. Not anger. Fear. You knew what that story cost me, I said evenly. You knew why it was sacred, and you chose applause over protection. He opened his mouth. Instinctively, reflexively, I didn't let him speak. This is the part where you would say it was a joke, I said. That I'm sensitive, that you didn't mean it like that. A few heads nodded, recognizing the script. But intention doesn't erase impact, and love doesn't laugh at wounds. I reached up and removed the ring, holding it between my fingers for a second longer than necessary. I'm not marrying someone who needs my pain to feel powerful, I said, and placed it on the stand between us. The sound it made was small, but the effect was not.
Someone in the back stood.
Then another. Applause began hesitantly, then gathered, not thunderous, but resolute. I stepped back, not waiting for permission, not looking for approval. As I walked down the aisle alone, I didn't feel triumphant in the way movies promise. I felt intact. For the first time in a long time, nothing inside me was negotiating.
The first thing I noticed outside was the air hitting my skin like honesty.
Inside, everything had been rehearsed softness and controlled smiles, but out here, the world didn't care that it was supposed to be a perfect day.
I stood on the steps with my bouquet still in my hand, and for a few seconds my brain tried to do what it had always done: scan for danger, anticipate backlash, prepared to apologize for taking up space. That reflex was old. It came from years of learning that if I stayed pleasant, I stayed safer. I looked down at my hands and realized they weren't shaking. That was new. Denise came out behind me, fast but not frantic, and when she reached me, she didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't say, "Maybe you should have handled it privately." She just wrapped her arms around me with a steady strength that felt like a door closing behind me. "You did what he never expected," she whispered. "You told the truth without begging for permission." I pressed my forehead to her shoulder and let myself breathe all the way down.
My chest hurt, but it wasn't the old kind of hurt.
It was the burn of a muscle being used after years of holding still. From inside, sounds leaked out in bursts, like the room was trying to decide what to become now that the script was torn up. I heard Yvette's voice first, sharp and outraged, the tone she used when a plan didn't obey her. "Turn that off," she snapped, and then louder, "This is a disgrace." I didn't hear Malcolm at first.
That silence said more than any excuse he could have offered.
Malcolm only knew how to speak when he could control the room.
When he couldn't, he went blank. A member of the staff approached us carefully, like he didn't want to step on a live wire. "Ma'am," he said, eyes flicking between Denise and me, "do you need anything? A car? A private room?" The word private almost made me laugh, because privacy was what I had begged for emotionally for so long and never gotten.
"A car," Denise answered before I could. Then she looked at me and said softly, "Don't go back in there. Not even to prove you're not afraid. You already proved what matters." As we waited, my phone started buzzing in my clutch in a steady rhythm, call after call, like the outside world had been watching through a crack and now wanted a piece of the fallout. I didn't answer at first. My mind went back to every moment of silence that led here, like a film my brain had stored and finally decided to play in full. The first time Yvette commented on my plate. The first time Malcolm asked me to redo a photo because my arms looked bigger than usual. The first time he said, "You know I'm only trying to help," after something that didn't feel like help at all.
Each time I had swallowed my discomfort and called it maturity.
Each time I had told myself that speaking up would ruin the peace.
The truth I hadn't wanted to face was that peace was never mine. It was a favor I performed for them. My silence wasn't weakness, not at the beginning. It was survival. It was me reading the room and choosing the option that caused the least immediate harm. When you fought an eating disorder, you learn something brutal about control. It can look like strength while it's quietly hollowing you out. I had replaced one kind of control with another. I used to control food to feel safe. Later, I controlled my voice to feel safe. Both were Kate's. One just looked more polite. My phone buzzed again, and this time I saw Malcolm's name. For a second, a part of me wanted to answer just to hear him scramble. I wanted to hear the panic in his voice. I wanted the satisfaction of watching him try to stitch dignity back onto himself.
But I also knew his pattern. He would aim for the softest angle, the private angle. He'd try to pull me into a side conversation where he could rewrite what happened. He'd say, "Can we talk?" Like that would shrink the whole room back down to his preferred size. I stared at his name until the call stopped, and I felt something settle in me, a boundary that didn't require an argument. Denise's phone rang, and she answered with a calm that made me admire her even more. "Yvette," she said, not warm, not cold, just factual. I couldn't hear the other side, but I could imagine it. Blame, outrage, demands. Denise waded through it, then said, "You raised him to believe he could turn someone's pain into entertainment and still be called a good man. Today, the room disagreed." She listened again, then added, "No, I won't tell her to come back inside. She isn't your prop." Denise ended the call and exhaled, like she had been holding her breath for years, too.
She's furious, Denise said.
Not at him, at you. That tells you everything.
A car arrived and we got in. As the venue disappeared behind us, I expected to feel grief like a wave knocking me over.
I expected sobbing, collapse, regret. Instead, I felt a strange quiet, like the moment after you drop something heavy you didn't realize you were carrying. The sadness was there, yes, but it sat beside something else. Relief. Not relief that the wedding was over, but relief that I didn't have to keep auditioning for respect that should have been automatic. On the drive, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Terrence, the groomsman whose voice had been on that memo. It wasn't an apology. It was defensive, hurried, full of disbelief. You didn't have to do all that. It was just jokes. Nobody meant it like that. The word nobody made my stomach twist because it was the same logic that had kept me quiet for so long. If the room doesn't recognize your hurt, the hurt becomes invalid. I typed back slowly, choosing each word like a lock clicking shut. If it was funny, it can be funny without me. Then I blocked his number and felt my shoulders drop an inch. Later that day, I finally answered a call from my cousin, Alana. Her voice was trembling with a mix of pride and shock. "Bree," she said, "I saw the clip. Someone posted it. I'm not gonna lie, my heart stopped. I swallowed, because hearing that it was already spreading made my skin prickle with vulnerability. Are they tearing me apart? I asked, and I hated that my first worry was how I was being judged. Alana didn't hesitate. Some are, but most are saying what I've been wanting to yell for years. You don't owe anyone quiet suffering. I closed my eyes, and the sentence landed like water on a fire.
That evening, Denise came by with a small bag and that same grounded energy. She sat with me at the table like we were planning something ordinary, and in a way we were, the next step.
He's trying to regain control, she said. He's calling relatives, framing it like you ambushed him. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course he is, I said. That's his favorite costume. Victim in a nice suit. Denise nodded. Yvette is pushing the story that you're unstable, that you overreacted because you have issues. The word issues made my jaw clench because it was a neat little box for anything a woman survives.
Let her, I said.
I'm done arguing with a woman who calls cruelty discipline. The next few days were a blur of messages, calls, fragments of reactions. Some guests reached out quietly, almost ashamed. A woman from Malcolm's side left a voicemail that started with, "I'm sorry, I didn't know," and ended with, "I should have said something when I heard the way they talk." That line hit me hard because it confirmed what I had always suspected. There had been witnesses to my slow erosion, and the room had chosen comfort over intervention.
I didn't hate them for it.
I recognized it.
Many had learned the same survival language I had.
Stay pleasant.
Don't disrupt.
Let it slide.
But something changed after that altar moment.
The same way silence trains a family to cross boundaries, truth trains a room to recognize them.
Some guests stopped laughing along.
Some relatives stopped defending Malcolm automatically.
Denise told me that 2 of his friends refused to stand with him afterward, not in dramatic fashion, just a quiet distance that spoke louder than any confrontation.
Malcolm's image depended on unanimous support.
Once cracks showed, the facade started to wobble.
Malcolm finally managed to get a message to me through an unknown number.
It was longer than his usual texts, full of the careful language of someone trying to sound accountable without actually being accountable.
He wrote that he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt me, that he felt blindsided, that I didn't have to do it like that it could have been handled privately. I read it twice, and what stood out wasn't the apology. It was the grief over losing the stage. He didn't mourn my pain. He mourned the fact that the room saw him clearly.
I didn't reply. A reply would have been another performance, and I had retired from that job.
In quiet moments, the cost of my former silence became undeniable. I thought about how many times I edited myself to avoid backlash, how many times I chose the smallest version of my truth because it was easier for everyone else to digest. I used to think my restraint was love. Now I saw it was unpaid labor. My silence kept their world smooth, while my inner life got sharper and smaller.
It wasn't that I lacked strength.
It was that I misdirected it. I spent my strength maintaining a peace that never protected me. And then I felt the turning point, deep and irreversible. I no longer feared being alone. That fear had been the hook they used on me, the quiet threat under every correction.
Be grateful. Be chosen. Don't ruin it.
But once I walked away from a wedding in front of a full room, once I let the truth land and refused to catch it for them, I realized loneliness wasn't the worst outcome. Losing myself was. Weeks later, I stood in front of my mirror and looked at my body without bargaining. Not with praise, not with punishment, just with recognition. This body had carried me through hunger and healing, through shame and recovery, through the temptation to disappear and the decision to stay. I heard Malcolm's laughter again in my memory, but it sounded distant now, like a radio in another apartment. The louder sound was my own voice at the altar, steady, clear, unafraid. That voice didn't come from anger alone. It came from the part of me that had been fighting to live honestly long before Malcolm ever appeared.
I don't pretend the aftermath was easy.
There were lonely mornings.
There were nights when my brain tried to replay every detail and ask if I could have handled it differently. But every time that question rose, another truth answered it. Handling it differently would have meant handling it smaller, quieter, and more convenient for the same set of boundaries that kept crossing me. I didn't leave that day broken.
I left that day aligned. My silence didn't vanish.
It transformed. Now, when I'm quiet, it isn't submission.
It's choice.
It's calm. It's a boundary I control. And if I ever stand at an altar again, it won't be as a woman hoping to be protected by someone else's promise. It will be as a woman who already knows how to protect herself and who will only accept love that treats tenderness as sacred, not as material for a joke.